Happy New Year. What brings you here at this hour?
I know the timing is bad, but I needed to see you.
The knock wouldn't come for another 40 minutes, but if Evan Morales had known that, he still would have felt the same ache in his chest, the same heavy certainty that this New Year's Eve would end the way so many others had since his life. Split into before and after, alone, the snow began falling just after dusk. The kind that didn't rush or swirl, but drifted downward in patient silence, softening the sharp edges of the city. From the narrow living room window of his third-floor apartment, Evan watched it collect on the parked cars below, frosting their windshields and turning the street into something almost gentle. The streetlights glowed like blurred stars, halos spreading through the glass as if the world itself were slightly out of focus. Inside, the apartment was warm but quiet. Too quiet. A muted countdown played on the television, the sound turned low so it wouldn't wake his daughter. The anchor smiled with the practiced brightness of people who would ring in the new year surrounded by crowds, noise, and champagne things Evan had learned to live without. He glanced toward the couch. Sophia lay curled on her side, knees tucked in, her small hand gripping the ear of her stuffed rabbit like it might disappear if she let go. Her dark curls spilled over the pillow, and her lips were parted slightly in sleep. The cartoon fireworks frozen on the pause screen had lost her attention nearly an hour ago. She had tried so hard to stay awake. "I want to see the new year come," she'd said earlier. Eyes shining with the same stubborn determination she applied to everything, brushing her teeth, tying her shoes, insisting she was old enough to pour her own cereal. Evan hadn't had the heart to tell her that the new year didn't really come with fireworks anymore. It arrived quietly, usually when you weren't looking, like grief or acceptance. "You can try," he'd said instead, pulling a blanket over her legs. Now, at 11:23, she slept deeply, chest rising and falling in the steady rhythm that anchored Evan more firmly than anything else in his life. He stood by the window for a long moment, hands shoved into the pockets of his worn sweater, listening to the hum of the old radiator and the distant sounds of celebration leaking in from neighboring apartments. Somewhere above him, someone laughed loudly, a door slammed. Music pulsed faintly through the walls. Evan didn't begrudge them. Not really. He moved quietly to the kitchen, the small space illuminated by a single overhead bulb that flickered when he turned it on. The microwave clock read 11:24 p.m., its green numbers blinking steadily, indifferent to the weight people placed on them. He took a bottle of sparkling cider from the fridge, the non-alcoholic kind with a smiling apple on the label, and twisted off the cap. The soft pop echoed louder than it should have in the stillness. He poured it into a mismatched wine glass, one of only two left from a set he and his wife had received as a wedding gift years ago. For a moment, he didn't drink it. Instead, he rested his elbows on the counter and closed his eyes. 2 years. That was how long it had been since the accident. 2 years since a late-night phone call, since a hospital corridor that smelled like antiseptic and bad news, since the world had tilted so violently he'd wondered if it would ever right itself again. People had told him he was strong, resilient, brave. He'd learned those words usually meant you re-surviving in a way that makes the rest of us comfortable. He opened his eyes and took a sip. The cider fizzed against his tongue, too sweet, too sharp, but he swallowed it anyway. From the living room, the television announced 30 minutes until the new year, followed by enthusiastic applause. Evan checked on Sophia again, smoothing the blanket that had slipped down her shoulder. He brushed a curl from her forehead, his thumb lingering there just a second longer than necessary. "You did good," he whispered, though he wasn't sure if he meant tonight or the last 2 years. Carefully, he lifted her into his arms. She stirred, her rabbit slipping from her grip and tumbling to the floor. "Bunny," she murmured. "I've got him," Evan said softly, scooping up the toy and tucking it against her chest as he carried her down the short hallway. Her room was small but bright, decorated with crayon drawings taped to the wall, stick figures holding hands, suns with smiling faces, hearts in every color. He laid her in bed and tucked the covers around her, the practiced motion of a father who had done this alone every night for far too long. "Happy New Year, Daddy," she mumbled, eyes still closed. His chest tightened. "Happy New Year, Sophie," he replied, voice barely above a breath. He stood there until he was sure she was asleep again, then turned off the light and closed the door almost all the way, leaving it cracked just enough. Back in the living room, the couch looked emptier without her. Evan sat at the small kitchen table instead, scrolling absently through his phone. Messages lit up the screen group chats from work. Automated holiday greetings, a few texts from distant relatives he spoke to maybe twice a year. Happy New Year. Wishing you health and success in 2026. Hope this year brings you everything you deserve. He didn't reply to any of them. Not because he didn't care, but because he didn't know how to explain that what he deserved and what he wanted had drifted too far apart to fit in a text message. At 11:52, he muted the television entirely. The silence settled in, thick and unmistakable. Outside, a few premature fireworks cracked open the sky, flashes of color reflected faintly in the window. Evan finished his cider and rinsed the glass, setting it upside down on the rack. He leaned against the counter, eyes on the microwave clock as it ticked closer to midnight. This was the part he hated most. The seconds before the year changed, when everyone else counted down together. When couples kissed and friends hugged and strangers clinked glasses like the world was one big room full of warmth. This was the moment when absence screamed the loudest. At 11:59, he turned the television sound back on, more for habit than desire. The crowd on the screen roared, voices overlapping in excited chaos. 10, 9. Evan stood, lifting his empty glass as if it still held something worth toasting. 8, 7. He thought of promises he'd once made, plans he'd once believed in. 6, 5. He thought of Sophia's laugh, of how she still reached for her mother in her sleep sometimes. 4, 3. His throat tightened. 2, 1. Happy New Year. Confetti rained down on the screen. Fireworks exploded. The anchors hugged. The room around Evan remained unchanged. He lowered his glass slowly. Happy New Year, he said aloud, testing the words. They sounded thin in the air. For a long moment, he simply stood there, listening to the muted aftermath of celebration, the applause fading into background noise. He felt older than his 36 years, not in body but in spirit, like time had passed over him instead of through him. Another year survived, he thought. That had become his quiet metric for success. He turned off the television. The apartment plunged into near silence again, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator and the distant echo of fireworks outside. Evan moved to the window once more, watching the snow continue its slow descent, covering the evidence of everything that had come before. It was almost peaceful. Then the knock came, sharp, firm, unmistakably real. Evan froze, his heart slamming hard against his ribs. No one knocked on his door at midnight. Not friends, not neighbors, not family. His mind raced through possibilities and emergency in the building. A neighbor in trouble, something wrong with Sophia. The knock came again, louder this time. He swallowed and crossed the room, every step measured. His hand hovered over the lock as he leaned toward the peephole, bracing himself for whatever waited on the other side. What he saw made his breath catch. Standing in the hallway, framed by pale fluorescent light and falling snow tracked in from outside, was a woman he knew only in tailored suits and glass-walled boardrooms. Claire Whitman, his CEO. Her dark coat was dusted white at the shoulders, her hair loose instead of pulled back, her expression tense and uncertain. She glanced at her watch, then lifted her hand as if to knock again before Evan instinctively unlocked the door. The click of the lock sounded impossibly loud. The door opened. And just like that, the new year was no longer quiet. For a moment after the door opened, neither of them spoke. Evan stood frozen in the doorway, one hand still gripping the doorknob, his mind scrambling to make sense of the woman standing in his hallway. Claire Whitman, CEO of Whitman Solutions, architect of quarterly earnings calls and relentless growth strategies, looked profoundly out of place under the flickering fluorescent light. Snow clung to the shoulders of her charcoal coat, melting into dark patches. Her cheeks were flushed, either from the cold or something deeper, and her eyes held a tension Evan had never seen in the boardroom. She didn't look powerful. She looked unsure. "Mr. Morales," she said at last, her voice quieter than he expected. "I'm sorry to arrive so late. I wouldn't have if it weren't important." Evan blinked, his brain still lagging behind the moment. "Miss Whitman?" She winced faintly. Claire, please, tonight at least. He nodded, stepping back automatically. Of course. I didn't expect. No one ever expects their CEO to knock on their door at midnight, she said, attempting a smile that didn't quite land. I know, she hesitated at the threshold as if reconsidering the entire decision, then crossed inside. Evan closed the door behind her, the lock sliding into place with a soft finality that sent a strange shiver through him. The apartment felt suddenly smaller. Claire removed her gloves slowly, her gaze drifting around the living room. Evan became acutely aware of everything: the frayed edge of the rug, the stack of unopened mail on the counter, Sophia's rabbit lying abandoned on the couch. He resisted the urge to apologize for any of it. Is this a bad time? Claire asked, lowering her voice. No, Evan said quickly. My daughter's asleep. I was just... He stopped himself. Could I get you something? Water? Coffee? She considered this. Do you have champagne? Evan huffed out a short, surprised laugh before he could stop himself. No, sorry, just sparkling cider. Her shoulders relaxed a fraction. That's actually perfect. He retrieved the bottle from the fridge, pouring her a glass while she slipped off her coat and draped it carefully over the back of a chair. Without it, she looked smaller, dressed in a simple sweater and dark trousers instead of the commanding suits he was used to seeing, human, vulnerable even. They sat at the small kitchen table across from one another, the same one Evan had been alone at less than 10 minutes earlier. He slid the glass toward her. To the new year, she said softly, lifting it. To the new year, Evan echoed. They drank. The silence that followed wasn't awkward so much as heavy, laden with things neither of them seemed sure how to say. Evan waited, hands clasped loosely in front of him, heart still thudding with disbelief. Finally, Claire exhaled and leaned back in her chair. This is highly unorthodox, she said. Yes, Evan agreed. It is, she smiled briefly, then sobered. I'll be direct. This afternoon, the board finalized a restructuring plan. They're announcing it next week. Evan's stomach tightened instantly. Layoffs? Yes. The word landed like a weight between them. He straightened slightly, years of conditioned professionalism kicking in. No, she interrupted quickly. You're not losing your job. That's not why I'm here. Relief washed through him, sharp and dizzying, followed almost immediately by guilt. Someone else's relief would not come so easily. Then why? He began. I argued against it, she said. Against the scale of it, at least. But I was outvoted. Again, her jaw tightened. On my way home tonight, I realized something that scared me. Evan stayed quiet. I've been making decisions about people's lives from behind glass walls and polished tables, she continued. Numbers on screens, projections, efficiencies, and somewhere along the way, I stopped really seeing the people attached to those numbers. She looked directly at him now. You? Evan swallowed. Me? Yes, she nodded. I know your file better than most. Senior analyst, consistently exceeds expectations, never complains. Never late, he forced a small smile. That's the job. That's not all, she said gently. I know your wife passed away 2 years ago. I know you have a 6-year-old daughter. I know you turned down the regional manager role because it required travel. Evan's breath caught. He hadn't realized how much of himself lived in corporate records. I know, she went on, that you stayed late for months afterward because you couldn't afford to be seen as unreliable. I know you've used exactly half your allotted vacation days in 3 years. The room felt very still. Why are you telling me this? Evan asked quietly. Because tonight, Claire said, her voice softening, I realized I don't actually know what any of that costs. She gestured vaguely around the apartment. I wanted to see it. The reality, not the resume. Not the performance reviews. Evan leaned back in his chair, emotions tangling in his chest. So you came here, yes, at midnight, yes, on New Year's Eve. Yes, she said again, a hint of self-awareness creeping into her expression. I'm aware how absurd that sounds. It's unexpected, Evan said carefully. I didn't know where else to go, she admitted. I live in a penthouse that echoes even when it's full. My family's scattered across 3 continents. My phone hasn't stopped buzzing all night with congratulatory messages that feel hollow. She paused, fingers tightening around her glass. I didn't want to start another year pretending I was fine with that. Evan studied her, really looked at her for the first time beyond titles and authority. He saw the fatigue etched around her eyes, the tension she held like armor. You could have called, he said. She shook her head. This needed to be face to face. A small sound came from the hallway, a creak, the soft scuff of a slipper against the floor. Evan's head snapped toward the noise. Sophia, he murmured, already standing. I'm sorry, Claire said immediately. I didn't mean to wake her. You didn't, Evan said. She's a light sleeper. Before he could reach the hallway, a small figure appeared at the corner, rubbing her eyes. Daddy? Sophia's voice was thick with sleep. Evan crouched, arms open. Hey, sweetheart, what's wrong? She blinked at Claire, then back at him. Who's that? This is Claire, Evan said gently. She's a friend from work. Sophia considered this, her gaze solemn. Is she nice? Claire knelt down, lowering herself to Sophia's level. I try to be, she said softly. Happy New Year, Sophia yawned. Happy New Year. Satisfied, she climbed into Evan's arms without another word, her head dropping onto his shoulder as if the mystery had been solved. Evan carried her back to the couch and sat down, letting her settle against him. She won't remember this, he said quietly. Claire smiled, something warm and unguarded breaking through. I will. They resumed their conversation more softly after that, mindful of the small weight of sleep between them. I didn't come here to ask you for anything, Claire said. No loyalty. No silence. I just needed you to know that I see you. That your sacrifices matter. Evan stared at the darkened television screen. It's strange, he said after a moment. I didn't realize how invisible I felt until you said that. Her expression tightened. I'm sorry. He shook his head. You're not responsible for my loneliness. Maybe not, she said. But I am responsible for the culture that makes people feel like endurance is the same thing as well-being. He looked down at Sophia, her breathing even and calm. Endurance is sometimes all you have. Claire nodded slowly. I know. They sat like that for a long time, the new year unfolding quietly around them. Outside, the fireworks faded. The snow continued to fall. Eventually, Claire stood, slipping back into her coat. I should go. I've intruded enough. Evan rose as well, gently shifting Sophia so she wouldn't wake. You didn't intrude, he said. You surprised me. She smiled. That too. At the door, she paused. Thank you. For letting me see this. For trusting me with it. You're welcome, Evan said. Then, surprising himself, he added, You don't have to do everything alone. She met his gaze, something unreadable passing between them. Neither do you. After she left, Evan stood in the doorway for a long moment, holding his sleeping daughter as the hallway lights flickered softly. The year had begun differently than he'd expected, and somehow that felt like hope. Claire Whitman did not leave. That realization came to Evan gradually, like the slow recognition of a sound that didn't belong to the room. He had expected the night to return to its earlier stillness once she stepped back into the hallway, expected the quiet to reclaim its place like it always did. Instead, after standing by the door for several seconds, Claire exhaled, turned back toward him, and said softly, May I stay a little longer? Evan hesitated, not because he didn't want her there, but because he didn't know what it meant that he did. Sophia slept heavily in his arms, her head tucked beneath his chin, the faint warmth of her breath grounding him. He adjusted his hold and nodded. Yeah, of course. Claire slipped out of her coat again, slower this time, as if acknowledging the weight of the moment. She set it back on the chair and returned to the table, running her fingers along the edge as though orienting herself in unfamiliar territory. Evan carried Sophia to her bedroom once more, laying her gently on the bed and pulling the covers up. She stirred briefly, then sighed and rolled onto her side. He lingered for a moment, watching her, reminding himself that this small, ordinary miracle was the axis around which his life turned. When he returned to the kitchen, Claire was standing by the window, looking out at the falling snow. "It's beautiful," she said quietly. "I forget sometimes that the city can still feel like this. You don't get much quiet where you live?" Evan asked. She gave a short laugh. "Only the kind that echoes." They sat again, this time closer, the space between them less guarded. Evan poured the last of the sparkling cider into their glasses. It felt oddly ceremonial, like a continuation of something that had already begun. "I meant what I said," Claire said after a moment, "about seeing you. About your work mattering." "I believe you," Evan replied. "That's what scares me," she frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because if you really see us," he said, choosing his words carefully, "then you see how fragile it all is. How close most people are to losing everything." Claire nodded slowly. "That's exactly what scared me too." She leaned back in her chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "Do you know how many people congratulated me tonight? On the year we've had? On the growth? The profits?" Evan shook his head. "None of them asked me how it felt," she said. "Not one. And I realized I didn't know how to answer anyway." She looked back at him. "I built my life around being indispensable. Around being the one with answers. Somewhere along the way I stopped asking questions." Evan studied her face, the lines softened by the low kitchen light. "You don't seem like someone who's used to uncertainty." "I hate it," she admitted. "I hate not knowing if I'm doing the right thing. I hate that no matter what decision I make, someone pays for it." "That's leadership," Evan said. "Or so I've heard," she smiled faintly. "Is that what it looks like from where you're sitting?" He considered the question. "It looks lonely," the word landed between them, heavy but honest. "Yes," Claire said quietly. "It is." They sat in silence again, but this time it was different, not empty, but reflective. Evan felt something loosening in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "I never planned for this life," he said suddenly. Claire turned toward him, attentive. "I had plans," he continued. "They were ordinary, boring maybe, but they were ours. A house. Another kid. Vacations we couldn't really afford," he laughed softly. "We used to joke about how predictable we were becoming." "And then?" Claire prompted gently. "And then everything shattered," Evan said. "And the world kept going like it always does. Bills, deadlines, school drop-offs." He rubbed his hands together, a nervous habit. "People kept telling me how strong I was. How amazing it was that I was handling it." He looked up at her. "I wasn't handling it, I was just still standing." Claire's eyes glistened, though she didn't look away. "I'm sorry," she said again, this time with more weight. "I don't tell people this," Evan admitted. "Not because I'm ashamed, but because grief doesn't fit into conversations very well. It makes people uncomfortable." "I'm not uncomfortable," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's why I'm telling you." The clock on the microwave ticked past 1 a.m., unnoticed. Claire took a breath. "May I tell you something I don't usually say out loud?" Evan nodded. "I never wanted children," she said. "Not because I don't like them, but because I was terrified I'd fail them, that I'd miss the important moments, that I'd be physically present but emotionally absent." She swallowed. "So I chose work instead. It was simpler, clear metrics." "Clear wins? And now?" Evan asked. "And now," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I'm afraid I've failed anyway. Just at something I didn't know I was supposed to be good at." Evan leaned back, absorbing that. "You showed up tonight," he said. "That counts for something." She smiled sadly. "Does it?" "Yes," he said firmly. "It means you're paying attention." A faint sound came from Sophia's room, a sigh, a shift. Evan instinctively glanced down the hallway. "You're a good father," Claire said. He shook his head. "I'm just the one who stayed." "That's not just anything," she replied. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at it, then turned it face down without checking the message. "Another board member?" Evan guessed. "Yes," she said, "or a journalist. Or someone reminding me that tomorrow starts another quarter." She met his eyes. "Do you ever wish you could pause it all? Just for a moment?" "Every day," Evan said, "but Sophia doesn't pause. She grows whether I'm ready or not." Claire smiled at that, something wistful in her expression. "She's lucky." "So are you," Evan said before he could stop himself. She raised an eyebrow. Am I? You have the power to change things, he said, not just for yourself. For people who don't get to knock on your door. She considered this, then nodded slowly. I want to try? The sincerity in her voice surprised him. I can't promise I'll win every fight, she continued. But I can promise I won't hide behind distance anymore. Evan felt a quiet shift inside himself, not hope exactly, but something adjacent. Recognition, maybe. The clock read 1:42 a.m. when Claire finally stood. I really should go now, she said. Thank you for trusting me with your story. Thank you for listening, Evan replied. At the door, she paused, hand on the handle. Evan? Yes? If the world feels heavy again this year, she said, I hope you'll tell someone. You don't have to carry it alone. He nodded. I'll try. She smiled, then stepped into the hallway, her presence lingering even after the door closed behind her. Evan leaned against the door for a moment, eyes closed. Nothing in his life had changed in any measurable way. No promises had been made. No problem solved, and yet something felt different, not lighter, but shared. He returned to the living room and sank onto the couch, listening to the quiet hum of the apartment, the steady breathing of his daughter down the hall. Outside, the snow continued to fall, covering the city in a clean, temporary hush. For the first time in a long while, Evan didn't feel invisible in it. Morning came quietly. Evan realized this not because of sunlight or sound, but because his body, trained by years of routine, stirred before his mind caught up. For a few disoriented seconds, he lay still on the couch, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady hum of the refrigerator and the distant hiss of traffic waking up beyond the walls. Then memory settled in. The knock, the conversation. The way the new year had arrived, not with fireworks, but with honesty. He sat up slowly, rubbing his face. His neck ached from sleeping at an angle, but it was a familiar discomfort, one he accepted without complaint. The apartment felt the same as it always did, modest, slightly cluttered, lived in, but something beneath the surface had shifted like a current changing direction. From down the hall came the unmistakable sound of Sophia singing to herself. Evan smiled. He stood and stretched, then walked toward her room just as she emerged in her oversized pajamas, hair a wild halo around her face, rabbit tucked under one arm. Daddy, she said brightly. It's New Year's Day. I know, he said. Happy New Year, she beamed. I dreamed it was snowing candy. Was it better than regular snow? She considered this. Messier. They laughed, and for a moment the world felt astonishingly light. As Evan made breakfast toast, eggs, orange juice, Sophia insisted on pouring herself. His phone buzzed on the counter. He glanced at the screen and froze. A message from Claire Whitman. Thank you again for last night. I hope the year begins gently for you and Sophia. No corporate signature, no formal language. Just a sentence that felt human. Evan set the phone down without replying, letting the moment exist as it was. He didn't want to overthink it. Didn't want to turn something fragile into something transactional. Daddy, Sophia said around a mouthful of toast. Is your friend coming back? He raised an eyebrow. Which friend? The lady, she said. The one who came when it was nighttime. Evan paused. I don't know, sweetheart, she nodded, apparently satisfied. She was nice. Yes, he said softly. She was. The day unfolded slowly, the way holidays often did when there was nowhere particular to be. They watched cartoons, built a lopsided tower out of blocks, went outside briefly so Sophia could stomp in the snow, her laughter echoing down the street like a declaration. Evan watched her from the sidewalk, hands in his pockets, heart full in that quiet, aching way that came with loving someone so completely it frightened him. That afternoon, while Sophia napped, Evan sat at the kitchen table with his laptop open, not working, not exactly, just staring at the screen. For years he'd operated on autopilot. Wake up, get Sophia ready, go to work, do the job well. Come home, repeat. Survival had been his only ambition. But Claire's words echoed in his mind. Endurance isn't the same thing as well-being. He closed the laptop. Maybe this year didn't need to be about pushing harder. Maybe it could be about something smaller. Quieter, more honest. The thought felt dangerous. And hopeful. The office was eerily calm the following Monday. The holidays had thinned the workforce, leaving wide stretches of cubicles empty, their blinking monitors and abandoned coffee mugs reminders of lives temporarily paused. Evan logged in, checked his emails, and immersed himself in the familiar comfort of numbers and patterns. At 10 sharp, a company-wide meeting request appeared on his calendar. His stomach tightened. The announcement. He felt the weight of it in every keystroke, every breath. Around him, colleagues murmured, tension rippling through the room like static. When the meeting began, Claire's face appeared on the large screen at the front of the conference room. She looked composed, professional, but Evan could see the difference now, the subtle stiffness in her shoulders. The way her eyes scanned the room, not just the data. She spoke plainly, no euphemisms, no false cheer. The restructuring was happening. Positions would be eliminated, departments consolidated. It was painful. Necessary, the board insisted, but then something unexpected happened. Claire took responsibility. She spoke about the cost of decisions, about people, not headcounts, about the commitment to support those affected not just with severance packages, but with real assistance, time, resources, respect. The room was silent. Evan felt something loosen in his chest, not relief, not exactly, but recognition. She was trying. In a system that rewarded detachment, she was choosing presence. When the meeting ended, conversations erupted in hushed tones. Fear mixed with cautious gratitude. Nothing was solved, but something had shifted. An hour later, an email arrived from Claire. Even if you have time this week, I'd like to talk. No agenda? Just a conversation? He stared at the message for a long moment before replying. I have time. They met on Thursday evening, not in her office, but at a small cafe halfway between their neighborhoods. It was the kind of place that smelled like coffee and baked bread. With mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu written in uneven handwriting, Claire arrived without her usual entourage. No assistant, no driver. Just her wrapped in a wool coat, hair tucked behind her ears. This feels less intimidating, she said, glancing around as she sat. Evan smiled. It does. They talked for over an hour, not about work, not really, about books. About Sophia, about the strange pressure of being expected to have everything figured out by a certain age. I don't, Claire admitted at one point. Have it figured out? Me neither, Evan said. I just stopped pretending, she laughed, genuine and surprised. When they parted ways that night, there was no promise made, no clear definition given to what this connection was becoming, but there was warmth and intention, and that felt like enough. Winter deepened, snow came and went. Sophia learned to ride her bike without training wheels. Evan found himself laughing more often, sleeping a little better. He began taking his full lunch breaks instead of eating at his desk, small rebellions, necessary ones. Claire followed through on her commitments. She listened more, asked harder questions. She still made decisions that upset people. Leadership didn't change overnight, but she no longer hid from the consequences. Sometimes, late at night, Evan thought about how strange it was that a single knock could alter the course of a year. How fragile the moments were that changed us most. On the last day of January, Evan and Sophia stood on the balcony, watching snow fall again. Daddy, Sophia said, leaning against him, this year really is different. He wrapped an arm around her shoulders. Yeah? You smile more. He looked down at her, at the child who had anchored him through every storm. You make that easy? She grinned and rested her head against his side. Evan gazed out at the city, the same buildings, the same streets, the same imperfect world. Nothing about it had magically transformed. But he had. Not because everything was fixed. Not because the future was suddenly clear, but because he no longer felt like he had to face it unseen. And that, he realized, was how new beginnings really worked. Not with noise, but with someone knocking on your door and staying long enough to remind you that you mattered.